It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about how much things shifted, artistically speaking.
Definitely.
We went from modernism, this real forward-looking view, belief in the future, clean lines, to something almost, well, the opposite.
Right.
A wild mix and match of styles from the past, often in ways you just never expect. Like, picture Hans Holstein's Strada Novissima in Vienna. You've got this, crumbling ancient column right next to a sleek Art Deco one.
Yeah, I know one.
And then, bam, a neon sign stuck on top. It's this really bizarre, kind of playful collision of eras.
It really is. Or Massini's Proust chair, that's another good one.
Exactly. It feels like we're just rummaging through history's attic, grabbing bits here and there.
But not to perfectly recreate them.
No, not at all. It's about building something totally new, often wonderfully strange.
And what's so captivating there is that move away from modernism's big belief in progress.
Yeah.
That single, unified future idea. Postmodernism, like you're saying, really leans into fragmentation. This sense of borrowing, repurposing, pastiche, they often call it.
Right, pastiche.
And it fundamentally questions those big stories, the master narratives that defined earlier times.
So this plundering the past, as you put it, it's not always about admiration, is it?
Not necessarily. Often it's about taking things out of context, using irony, challenging the whole idea of originality.
Exactly. And that's the rabbit hole we're diving down today. We've got the Cambridge History of Postmodern Literature here as our map.
Our guide, yeah.
And our mission is basically to understand the roots, the key ingredients of postmodernism in literature.
Okay.
We're going to see how it talks back to history, even, believe it or not, way back to the 18th century.
Interesting.
How it took different shapes in different places. Cold War America, cyberpunk worlds, even this unique Celtic twist in Scotland.
And how it's still evolving.
Right? It's still evolving today. So think of this as your shortcut to getting a solid handle on postmodern lit without feeling like you need a PhD,
Sounds good. A way in.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So when we talk postmodern lit, the conversation often circles back to earlier stuff. It's fascinating how critics connect the dots.
Like who?
Well, one name that always comes up is Lawrence Spurn, the guy who wrote Tristram Shandy.
Ah, right.
Larry McCaffrey, for one, made this pretty bold claim that it's, quote, thoroughly postmodern in almost every way. Except, it was written in the 1700s.
That is bold for a book that old.
It is. But then you have someone like Thomas Kiemer stepping in saying, hang on, let's be careful about just slapping a label on it like it was way ahead of its time.
Okay. Bit of caution there.
Yeah, he points out critics usually see it in two main ways.
Yeah.
Either as part of this long tradition of Renaissance satire, or as an early glimpse of modern or even postmodern fiction. His worry is, if we only see it as a stepping stone, we miss what it meant in its own time.
Right, its own context.
Kiemer really stresses understanding the literary landscape of Stern's time. He says Tristram Shandy was deeply involved with the novel as a form that was still, very much developing.
So it was experimental for its time.
Exactly. While acknowledging the satire, the self-awareness, what we call metafiction now, where the book knows it's a book,
Yeah.
Kiemer argues we need to put it back in that original vibrant moment, not just see it as this lone precursor to stuff that came centuries later.
Okay. And it's not just Tristram Shandy getting this sort of retroactive postmodern tag, right?
No. Joe Bray takes a slightly different tack. He looks at how postmodern culture and society might connect with the 18th century through some maybe less famous works.
Like what?
Like Sarah Fielding and Jane Collier's The Cry, a dramatic fable, or Elizabeth Hamilton's translations of the letters of a Hindu Raja.
Okay.
He's less caught up in defining postmodern aesthetics and more interested in finding these points where different times seem to kind of echo each other.
Resonances across centuries.
What's really interesting with Bray is his focus on those early novel experiments, especially the self-awareness about how the story's put together. He mentions Brian McHale's idea of lifting the curtain, that moment a book reminds you you're reading something constructive.
Right, breaking the fourth wall, sort of.
Exactly. The Cry, for instance, has characters who literally debate the form of the story they're actually in.
Wow, okay.
And in Hamilton's work, you see her exploring female authorship, learning, which ties right into the big debates about print culture back in the 1790s.
So Bray's saying, even though the times are totally different, there might be these underlying similarities in how things like, say, difference or marginality work.
Precisely, these interesting parallels.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit then, look at the bigger historical picture. The book mentions Hobsbawm's idea, the long 19th and short 20th centuries.
Right, the standard framing.
But then it shifts to this more global view, suggesting maybe we should think of a very long 19th century like American Revolution all the way to World War II. That's a much bigger sweep.
Yeah, and it really highlights the rise and then the eventual sort of weakening of European imperial power globally.
That's right. World War I was definitely a huge shakeup. It challenged European dominance, shifted power towards the U.S., the Soviet Union.
Financially, militarily.
Yeah. But it's important to remember, outside Europe and the Americas, those colonial powers still held a lot of sway well into the 20th century.
Right. It wasn't an overnight collapse.
No. And culturally, Europe was still seen as this major center, where movements like modernism first really took off.
Okay, so let's jump forward. Post-war period, America especially. The book suggests American postmodernism can be seen as this kind of breakdown of really rigid ideas about identity.
The kind shaped by the Cold War, yeah. That very black and white, us versus them world.
Exactly. And it contrasts that with the intense pressure to conform in the 1950s.
Oh, absolutely. That heavy emphasis on conformity in the 50s, everyone embracing organized religion. Those pervasive containment narratives of the Cold War.
It seems almost the direct opposite of postmodernism's later critique of those big, all-encompassing stories.
But interestingly, the book points to Senator Joseph McCarthy as a kind of prototypical postmodern persona.
Which sounds counterintuitive at first, right?
McCarthy, yeah. How does that work?
Well, the argument is that McCarthy, through his whole performance, his methods, his rhetoric, really showed how identity could be, well, performative. A constructed role.
Ah, okay, like acting.
Sort of. It wasn't necessarily about deep, authentic beliefs, but more about the performance of belief for political gain. Like identity as a costume he put on.
I see. So identity as something fluid, constructed.
Exactly. And that's a core postmodern idea.
That is an interesting take. The book also talks about confessional poetry and Ginsberg, Lowell, and how that was also a kind of rejection of modernism, specifically that ideal of the anonymous, detached poet.
Right. These poets put themselves, their own lives, shaped by history, right smack in the center of the work, even during the 10th McCarthy years. Lowell's poem, Memories of West Street and Lepke, is a really strong example. He makes himself the autobiographical subject, someone shaped, even kind of intimidated by the historical moment. The poem's full of self-incrimination, blurring confession and accusation, a bit like the testimonies McCarthy was hearing. This flawed, self-aware narrator becomes really key for postmodern lit.
And then television, its impact.
Well, huge.
The book highlights how TV played with this whole idea of what's real versus what's just an image. These flat pictures creating these 3D worlds.
And the way people on TV looked right at you.
Yeah, so different from movies, which usually try to keep that illusion going, avoid the direct gaze.
Right, the willing suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
TV kind of broke that.
And the book says television sort of normalized the idea of a surveillance state, which fits with Cold War anxiety.
Yeah, that feeling of being watched but also doing the watching.
Yeah.
That external agency, it was constantly reinforced. Even something like TV Guide, helping people navigate these narratives beamed into their homes.
So the book throws out the specific date, October 1966, as a kind of symbolic birthday for postmodern fiction. Why then?
Well, it's partly tied to Raymond Fetterman starting his first novel, Double or Nothing.
Okay.
Which was super self-reflective, very experimental, what he calls surfiction, basically metafiction. Fiction that knows it's fiction.
Right. Pulls back the curtain.
Exactly. But it wasn't just him. That same year, you had this whole wave of novels published or reissued that were pushing in that same direction.
Like who else?
Barth's Giles Goat Boy, Brooke Rose's Such, Burroughs' The Soft Machine, Coover's Origin of the Brunists, Gas, Pynchone's Crying of Lot 49, a whole bunch.
Wow, quite a cluster.
Yeah, this concentration of experimental stuff hitting around the same time really suggests a big shift was happening.
Like a tipping point. Okay, let's shift to how we get information. The book talks about this move in the 19th century, away from just reporting events to actively creating pseudo-events.
Driven by the demand for news, yeah. The graphic revolution newspapers, faster image production.
Right. That's Daniel Borson's idea, focusing on supply and demand.
Yeah, but then the book contrasts that with Guy Debord's take, more critical, Marxist, from the Society of the Spectacle.
Ah, Debord, okay.
He argues this explosion of images, these manufactured pseudo-events, isn't just neutral. It operates under what he calls commodity capitalism.
So for Debord, it's not just about making news, it's about creating this constant spectacle.
Exactly, a spectacle of consumption. These dazzling images of power, wealth. They distract us from the real economic conditions, social inequality.
There's a magic trick. Look over here, not over there.
Precisely. Debord saw Borston's analysis as a bit limited because it didn't fully connect this news production machine to the wider system. For Debord, history itself becomes something constructed, reconstructed through images. This pseudo-history has to be constantly churned out to keep consumerism going.
Okay. Now, the 1960s, obviously huge changes, countercultures popping up everywhere. How did they connect with postmodern aesthetics? The book says they're not identical, but there are links.
Right, Marianne de Koven makes that point. You can't just say counterculture equals postmodernism, but there are definite connections.
How so?
Those 60s countercultures, especially the youth groups, less focused on traditional politics, were like this fertile ground for later postmodern aesthetics. They questioned norms, embraced experimentation.
Right.
Even if their specific goals weren't always explicitly postmodern, that questioning spirit resonated.
It's interesting, though, because a lot of the counterculture seem to be searching for authenticity outside consumer society, right? Like back to nature, communes.
Yeah, that back to the land thing, seeking something real.
But postmodernism, the book suggests, often embraces the fake, the simulation, like Baudrillard saying Disneyland is more real than the real world.
That's a really key difference. The counterculture, even with psychedelics challenging perception, was often hunting for a true self, an authentic life, often looking back to pre-modern ideas. Postmodernism, on the other hand, tends to question the very possibility of a stable, authentic self. It often delights in the artificial, the copy, blurring those lines.
Got it. So after WWII, this skepticism towards the big Enlightenment ideas, reason, progress, universal truth, it didn't just appear overnight.
No, the book argues it hardened gradually between the war's end and the 1960s. And the French nouveau romanciers, the new novelists, were important here.
Like Rob Grillet.
Yeah, people like Alain Rob Grillet, suggesting the world just didn't seem stable or easily decipherable anymore.
He saw a general change in the relations man sustains with the world.
Exactly, a world feeling fragmented, chaotic, hard to interpret. This growing skepticism then paved the way for a really strong postmodern style in U.S. writing by about 1970.
Right. Authors like Barth, Barthelme, Brodigan, Coover, Nabokov.
Yeah, influenced by alternative lifestyles, the Beats, Burroughs, but also European roots like Nabokov and Beckett.
And the book mentions Barthelme's sort of zany collage style, and Coover and Barth playing with metafiction, similar to the Nouveau Roman.
Yeah. The book even speculates that European authors, having lived through the war's trauma more directly, might have internalized it more deeply, influencing these postmodern forms.
That makes sense.
And it puts Samuel Beckett, living in occupied Paris in 1940, right at the center. Arguing his wartime experience, that total collapse of order profoundly shaped his post-war work, the trilogy especially.
So that sense of collapse feeds into the Nouveau Roman's focus on, what was it, unrelieved nothingness.
Exactly. That difficulty of finding meaning in the rubble, essentially.
Wow. Okay, shifting gears a bit. The rise of theory, later in the 20th century, Lyotard's idea of the postmodern as this mood of having to judge without criteria.
Yeah, that's a fascinating concept, episodic, potentially even before the modern.
How does that work?
Well, he suggests when someone breaks the rules and creates something truly new, like Virginia Woolf experimenting with a novel, that's a postmodern moment. It's only when we look back, analyze what she did, and start making new rules based on her innovations that we enter a new modern phase. So paradoxically, the postmodern can actually set the stage for the next modernism.
Huh. That's quite a twist. And how does the actual rise of literary theory, criticism becoming so prominent, fit in?
The book connects it to exploring those very conditions of just judgment in postmodern culture and its institutions, especially the university.
Right.
It gives kind of simplified history. Wider access to higher ed after the wars and decolonization meant more students, changing demands in academia.
Less focus on just establishing the correct text.
Exactly. Bibliography became less central. The focus shifted to interpretation, a deeper meaning of texts. Critical analysis became the main path to scholarly authority.
So debating meaning rather than just punctuation.
Pretty much.
Right.
Textual criticism broadened out massively.
Okay, now we're into what the book calls the major phase. Peak postmodernism, 1973-1991. Starts with a bang, literally. Charles Jenks and the demolition of Pruitt Ego in 72.
Yeah, Jenks famously called it the day modern architecture died. a symbol of the failure of modernist utopian ideals in housing.
And waiting in the wings was postmodern architecture.
Right. More open to popular taste, history, playfulness. Think Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eisener's book Learning from Las Vegas, a kind of manifesto for embracing everyday visual culture.
And Lyotard pops up again, his big idea in the postmodern condition about incredulity toward master narratives.
Yeah, those grand stories of progress, enlightenment, human liberation that underpinned modern thought.
We've lost faith in those.
That's Lyotard's argument. Postmodern culture values little narratives instead. Stories of specific groups, local knowledge, individual experiences, a shift from universalism to pluralism.
And architecture itself started being talked about like a language.
Very much so. Jenks talked about architectural words, metaphors, syntax. Peter Eisenman, too, early on, focusing on architecture as abstract language syntax over meaning.
And later, influenced by Derrida, he saw the building as a text.
Yeah, a complex structure of differences, open to interpretation, deconstruction, critically examining its underlying assumptions.
Now, this sounds cool. Erasure as a postmodern literary technique. Millhauser's The King and the Tree using weird symbols like editing marks.
Right, to show gaps in this fictional ancient text. It highlights the constructed nature of the text, the limits of knowing the past. Like, the text is erasing itself. The book contrasts that with poets like Celan and Jabez. Jabez uses a lexicon of absence, talking about what's not there. Celan uses negatives, ellipses, lots of white space language, falling silent.
A very deliberate use of absence. Powerful.
Definitely. Then there's the dematerialization of art in the late 60s, early 70s, Lucy Lippard's book.
Right, moving away from the physical object towards ideas.
Yeah.
Process.
Exactly. Challenging what art could be, questioning the art market's focus on sellable objects. Think Carl Andre's steel plates. It's about the concept, the arrangement, not just the steel itself.
And Lippard was trying to actively dismantle the gallery system.
Yeah, promoting art that was non-material, unsellable. Language itself became a key material for many artists then.
The book contrasts that early stuff with, say, Marina Abramovich's MoMA performance, calling it a perfect work of art for our time. Seems more institutionalized.
Yeah, but the key idea remains. The art is the surrounding activity, the context, the ideas, not just a physical thing. Artists like Barry and Wilson saw language as action, communication.
Okay, switching to film. Coppola's Apocalypse Now. The book sees it as this postmodern mix, a pastiche of new Hollywood styles.
Yeah, making the audience aware they're shifting between different cinematic worlds. McHale's idea of moving between ontological worlds applies really well.
Like the Kilgore sequence pulling us into the anti-Western or Vietnam Western world.
Exactly. Those films revise Western tropes to reflect Vietnam, offering a much more critical take on American history and power.
It mentions earlier films like Soldier Blue, Little Big Man, Altman's Buffalo Bill, critiquing Hollywood itself.
Right. And Hopper's The Last Movie, as this kind of meta-cinematic, maybe self-indulgent precursor. Apocalypse Now synthesizes all that awareness of film history, genre, the act of filmmaking. Very self-reflexive, very postmodern.
Okay, let's turn to second-wave feminism. Huge impact. The Pill, approved in 1960.
A major turning point, yeah. Greater reproductive control for women, enabling more social, economic autonomy, though the book notes complexities.
Right, concerns about distribution, Planned Parenthood in African-American communities. It wasn't simple.
No, important nuances there, but undeniably profound impact.
And then French feminism, écriture féminine, challenging traditional logic, grammar, trying to express female subjectivity rooted in the body.
Thinkers like Kristeva, Sixus, exploring a specifically female way of writing beyond male-dominated structures. And psychoanalysis Lacan was being reinterpreted by feminists, too.
The literary canon started expanding, too, right? More women authors, genres like memoirs, diaries, rediscovering neglected writers.
Absolutely. But, the book points out, early feminism wasn't perfect. Black feminists, Latina feminists, others critiqued its exclusions, its focus on white, middle-class experiences.
Audre Lorde's famous line, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house."
Exactly. Emphasizing the need for marginalized feminists to forge their own theories, their own modes of expression, to truly challenge power structures.
Okay. Now, gay and lesbian subcultures after Stonewall. The book warns against seeing it as just a simple progression from the margins to the mainstream.
Right. That linear narrative can erase earlier, non-Western forms of same-sex intimacy. And queer theory challenged those fixed identity categories, lesbian, gay, arguing they relied on the same exclusions as heterosexual.
There were critiques within the community, too. Assimilation, racism, classism.
Definitely. Steven Seidman highlights that tension between identity politics, needing categories, and post-structuralism's critique of stable collective identity.
But those categories were still strategically important, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. For community building, political rights. The book looks at Jonathan Glenn's novel Jack the Modernist as postmodern gay fiction exploring fragmented experience.
And it highlights gossip in the novel as a kind of counter-discourse.
Yeah, building community, challenging dominant narratives. Gossip becomes this tool for ethics within the community, exposing betrayal.
Interesting. And this quoting of historical figures in 80s gay culture, like Oscar Wilde's era.
Yes, suggesting this desire for self-definition, historical roots in an emerging subculture, using this camp historiography like magpies, thieves, bricoleurs, with an ambivalent take on an authentic self.
Then Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, key text for queer and Chicano studies, defining borderlands beyond geography.
As imagined spaces, states of mind. She connects queerness with mestiza consciousness, a path of knowledge, balancing dualities, though the book notes potential essentialism in identifying queerness with the hermaphrodite figure.
Right, and finally, Angels in America, Kushner's play engaging the AIDS crisis.
Profoundly postmodern, yeah. Blending realism and fantasy, diverse perspectives, African-American, leftist, Jewish, Mormon.
Using metadrama like split scenes, characters crossing over.
Exactly. To explore complex social political issues around AIDS in the 80s, Harper's cynical view of imagination versus Pryor's understanding of angels. Powerful, but not creative.
And that recurring image of San Francisco, apocalyptic or celestial.
Seen differently by different characters, reflecting inclusion or exclusion. Contrasted with Roy Cohn's cynical view of power.
The book also critiques how some postmodern theory, even deconstruction, sometimes overlooked specific subjects for abstract philosophy.
Yeah, contrasting that with Trinh T. Mingha's practice or Derrida's later work on the archive, the spectral subject and trauma like the Holocaust, suggesting a potential fetishism of abstraction sometimes, a risk of losing sight of lived experience.
Okay, let's hop over to Scotland. Celtic postmodernism. The book talks about writers in the 80s like Tom Nairn rethinking Scotland's history with Britain.
Yeah, arguing Britain wasn't this model modern nation, but kind of stuck historically due to its archaic politics. Nairn argued Britain never truly modernized, and the idea of UK-wide consensus was a delusion.
Providing a backdrop for Scottish writers grappling with identity.
Exactly. And the book points to Frank Kupner, A Concussed History of Scotland. Ridiculous, absurd, disgusting, as classic Celtic postmodernism, even deconstruction.
Undermining character, plot, identity itself.
Totally. The narrator shifts identities constantly, man, woman, dog, clothing, blends metaphysics with mundane life, and he explicitly warns against the crystallization of authority in writing. Contains a sort of watermark. Beware of such authorities.
Okay. Next up, historiographic metafiction. Linda Hutchins' concept.
Yeah, postmodern lit that's self-contradictory but critically revisits the past. Uses political awareness and metafictional play. Mostly post-1945 fiction, but not strictly limited.
And it questions our access to historical reality beyond language.
Right. Less about empirical accuracy, more about the discursive context of historical language, how language shapes our understanding of the past.
So it reveals the constructed nature of all reality, including history.
While still acknowledging past events happened, and we have limits to knowing them fully from here. That's a tricky balance.
Okay. Now, high and low, or avant pop. That MoMA exhibition in the early 90s trying to connect high art and pop culture, newsprint, graffiti, comics. But it got bad reviews.
Yeah, critics felt it just reinforced MoMA's modernist canon. Didn't really get postmodernism. But the book argues the exhibition itself, regardless of intention, showed a postmodern shift.
How so?
Modernism defined itself against popular culture. Guison's Great Divide. Postmodernism rejects that divide, fosters a new creative link between high art and mass culture.
Which leads to avant pop, like avant-garde jazz guys covering pop songs.
Exactly that analogy. Larry McCaffrey used the term for fiction merging pop culture stuff, movies, TV, comics, rock with the avant-garde impulse. Like modernists use classical myth.
So blending high and low forms.
Right, but with this tension, are you engaging critically or just capitulating to the market? It walks that line.
And modularity interchangeable units is common to both pop and avant-garde, using cyberpunk as an example.
Yeah, Sterling's 20 Evocations. Cut and reshuffled prose creating a world sense without strict realism. That modularity remixing. Very postmodern.
Next, the Oulipo, language poetry and proceduralism. Constraint-based methods in avant-garde movements in the 60s and 70s, Oulipo in France, language poetry in the U.S.
Right. This interest in rules, generative procedures, radical appropriation, seen as a response to technology, mass media, the information age, challenging old ideas of originality.
Miquel seeing machines as models, Huntsberger seeing procedural poetry, commenting on production consumption in capitalism.
Exactly. And Ron Silliman's development as a language poet is key here. His procedural poem, Ketchak.
Expanding paragraphs, rules for repetition, expansion, new sentences.
Yeah, a powerful example. A breakthrough. He deliberately moved away from traditional forms focused on personal expression. Ketchak is this huge, almost algorithmic structure.
And contemporary writers are still using these methods. Found texts, constraints, digital tools.
Yeah, seen as continuing these avant-garde traditions into the digital age.
Okay, from avant-garde lit to music. From punk rock to the politics of pop. Late 60s, rock starts seeing itself as serious art. Progressive rock resistance.
Yeah, this aesthetic of progress, politics of resistance, rock claiming artistic integrity against the commodifying music industry, prioritizing expression over market concerns. Or so the image went.
But the book contrasts this with dance pop, which is more open about its industrial roots, uses digital tech.
Right, that rock pop distinction, rack resisting, pop succumbing was often heavily gendered too. Rock's art status was often a masculinized claim of authenticity and self-determination.
Interesting point. Okay, cyberpunk. SF subgenre, 80s Gibson's Neuromancer, high-tech, low-life, blurring human-tech boundaries.
Yep. Though there was debate in SF circles, was it really new or more like an avant-garde within SF, sometimes called radical hard SF early on?
And its depiction of cyberspace. It challenges Baudrillard's idea of simulacra replacing reality.
Yeah, the book argues that in cyberpunk, the virtual and physical aren't totally separate. They're governed by similar power structures. Cyberspace actually reveals existing power geometries, those bright lattices of control, rather than replacing the real.
Okay, turning to postmodern China, how postmodern ideas arrived and developed there. Initial focus on deconstruction, later engaging globalization, local contexts.
Right. Avant-garde writers explored postmodern techniques, subjectivity, narrative, language. Qin Shu, Yuhua mentioned, big cultural fever in the 80s, debating Western philosophy.
But official ambivalence,
Yeah.
association with Westernization.
Yeah, but then in the 90s, with rapid urbanization, consumerism, globalization, postmodern discourse got linked to those changes. An ambivalent attitude often reflected in the literature, this sense of schizophrenic reality.
And postmodern architecture popping up too, like Pudong in Shanghai.
Exactly. That skyline is a physical sign, rapid development compressing time, space, history. A bit like cyberpunk's poetics, actually.
Okay, tricky one. Hip-hop is not postmodern. Complex relationship. Features like blurring high-low culture via sampling, eclecticism, parody, irony.
Definitely parallels. The book uses Grandmaster Caz's story as a key postmodern narrative within hip-hop. Skepticism towards master narratives of success.
His Grandmaster title as self-legitimation within the subculture facing commercial appropriation.
Exactly, establishing status within their own space.
Moving to the interregnum, 1989-2001. The 90s, between Cold War and War on Terror. Multiculturalism flourishing, but also the culture war's backlash.
Yeah, proliferation of subcultures, grunge, gangster rap, indie films, new age, internet, many going mainstream eventually. A hope for we-ness based on accepting difference, fueled by globalization, new tech.
Then global fictions, works dealing with transnational themes, hybrid identities, often post-colonial diasporic experiences. Rushdie, as an example.
And postmodern techniques, fragmentation, intertextuality, unreliable narration, worked well for exploring these fluid identities, global issues. Popular genres, mystery, sci-fi, thriller, becoming a kind of a lingua franca for writers crossing borders, too.
Now, digital culture and posthumanism. Reflexivity, self-awareness, key in both postmodern and digital lit, but a difference.
Yeah. Postmodern lit often foregrounds language's artifice. Digital lit starts with a medium that's already defamiliarized, based on code.
Moulthrop's Victory Garden, the virtual disappearance of Miriam, examples of digital literary reflexivity. Miriam using familiar interfaces like Windows dialog boxes.
Right, moving towards media-specific self-consciousness. And the connection to posthumanism, questioning traditional humanist ideas of identity, embodiment in a tech world.
Levy seeing cyberculture moving towards a new humanism, liberty, equality, fraternity online, and a return to materiality.
Yeah, that linguistic turn maybe swinging back towards the material dimensions of bodies, text, tech.
Revisiting the long 90s, the culture wars, unease, loss of shared values, debates on political correctness, multiculturalism, the canon.
Often from unstable positions, defying simple liberal-conservative divides. The book uses the film Lone Star as an example of postmodernism tackling identity, history, borders.
Mutable identities, generational conflicts over history, disidentifying with racist legacies, forget the Alamo, connecting to Kristeva Derrida.
Yeah, disidentification for heterogeneity, respecting difference and universality, that tolerance for ambiguity, complexity, a key postmodern lens on the culture wars.
Finally, the big one. After postmodernism, ongoing debates, new terms proposed: digimodernism, postmodernism. Some see a return to realism, ethics.
The book looks at David Foster Wallace's complex relationship, trying to bridge avant-garde postmodernism, Gaddis, the social novel, Balzac, formal experiment, Perec, and the story cycle resurging as a hybrid form.
Postmodernism still influential in China. Baudrillard on consumption. Postmodern ecology bridging human nature.
Yes, but also crucial post-colonial critiques. The irony of postmodernism, an anti-universalist philosophy, potentially getting universalized itself, risking recentering a Western framework, reducing the other to a theme. Still, it continues to shape contemporary lit, even post-apocalyptic narratives reflecting current anxieties.
So, wrapping this deep dive up, what are the big takeaways? Postmodern lit has this really complex, dynamic relationship with the past, re-examining, reinterpreting.
It grew out of specific moments, post-war, Cold War, rise of mass media.
Marked by specific techniques, metafiction, pastiche, irony, fragmentation. And it keeps evolving with globalization, tech, social shifts.
Understanding these core things really gives you a framework for tackling a lot of contemporary culture, literary or otherwise.
Yeah, helps you see how writers and artists challenge old ideas about stories, identity, reality, offering a more nuanced, maybe ambiguous view of things.
Definitely more complex view.
Absolutely. Hopefully you feel like you've got a clearer handle on postmodern lit now without needing that PhD we mentioned. So here's a final thought to leave you with. How does this deep-seated skepticism towards grand narratives, that hallmark of postmodernism, how does that play out today in our totally information-saturated world? How does it shape your own understanding of truth and knowledge when everyone seems to have their own version of reality just a click away?